Hey there, everybody, I'm Jesse Weber, and welcome back to Law&Crime's continued live coverage of the Sean Combs criminal case at a federal court in New York. Today is a very important day. Why? Jury's not there. You might be saying, why is it an important day? Why? Because at 2 p.m., we thought it was going to be 12. They pushed it back to 2 p.m. The court is going to go live with the attorneys and the judge to go over jury instructions in this case. So important in a complicated racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution case. The law matters. The elements matter. This is going to be the roadmap that the jury is going to use in their deliberations. This is the law that will guide them. And it's a complicated case. So how both sides tweak the language, what they cut out, what they're telling the jury they need to find in order to find Sean Combs guilty is so important. Now, closing arguments will happen tomorrow. We think it's actually going to extend into Friday. This jury might not even be handed the case until Monday. And by the way, it might take them some time to actually go through the jury instructions. Now, if you want to talk about one word that defines this morning so far in this case, confusion. There is confusion. Why? So first of all, I've seen a lot of chatter about this. We're going to be taking your questions about this whole case, including this issue as well. So this is our lunchtime show. If you have any questions for the next hour, submit them. We'll answer them. But what happened? The court submitted a letter last night, and I'm going to read you a portion of this letter. Now, in the racketeering, by the way, racketeering conspiracy, the prosecution is not only alleging that Sean Combs operated a criminal enterprise, that there was a criminal agreement between him and others to facilitate crimes and cover them up, and that portion of the charge, but that they have to prove at least two underlying crimes. There is racketeering, there is forced labor, there's kidnapping, there's arson, there's bribery, there's sex trafficking, there's drug offenses. Well, what happened? The government submitted a letter, and it says this. In an effort, by the way, to streamline the jury instructions, make them more easily digestible, they say specifically, the government has removed instructions from the charge relating to attempted kidnapping under both California and New York law, attempted arson under California law, and aiding and abetting sex trafficking. Now, there's been a lot of chatter today and a lot of reporting that, oh my gosh, the prosecutors are completely throwing out kidnapping and arson, which were big factors in this case. A lot of evidence came forward about that with Capricorn Clark, Kid Cudi. I don't think that's accurate. Why? I'm going back to the latest indictment in this case. And under the racketeering charge, when they talk about all of the predicate crimes, they talk about this. I'm going to read it verbatim. Multiple acts involving kidnapping, and then it says it's chargeable under the following provisions of state law. California law, kidnapping. California law, attempted kidnapping. California law, aiding and abetting kidnapping. California law, conspiracy with kidnapping. There's New York law, kidnapping. New York law, attempted kidnapping, aiding and abetting, and so forth. My take is, yeah, they might be getting rid of the aiding and abetting with respect to California law and New York law. They might be getting rid of attempted arson under California law, aiding and abetting of sex trafficking. But you still have the kidnapping. You still have conspiracy of kidnapping. You still have aiding and abetting with kidnapping, and the same thing goes with arson. So I don't think they're throwing out all of these charges. But I want to talk about it. I want to bring on right now Law&Crime's in-court reporter Elizabeth Millner, who's going to be in court later today when hopefully they clarify this a little bit up. Elizabeth, you and I were talking about this. If you have any guidance about what you think is going on here, but also to provide more context, doesn't it seem unlikely that the prosecutors would abandon outright all of arson and all of kidnapping considering what was presented to this jury?
Yeah, it seems like a really kind of surprising announcement that they made in this particular letter, especially given the amount of evidence that we heard, especially when it was coming to, or when it had to relate to Capricorn Clark, or even instances of Cassie being locked in these hotel rooms, or when it comes to going back to Capricorn Clark, the whole lie detector aspect, and her having to go inside that, I guess, abandoned building, right when they were kind of switching offices in order to be having to do these lie detector tests over and over and over again after multiple multiple days. And I thought that was probably maybe the strongest piece of evidence the government had in relation to those. So it was really surprising that that decision came down. But it doesn't mean, again, to your point, Jesse, that they're abandoning everything. It doesn't mean that charges are dropped. I think a lot of people are kind of miscommunicating that they think that, oh, Diddy's about to walk free today. It's none of that. And so it was a pretty surprising decision by the government. Maybe they were persuaded a little bit by Alexandra Shapiro's argument yesterday when they were moving for that motion for the judgment of acquittal. But in the end of the day, we'll kind of get more clarity once the charge conference begins. I was a little disappointed it's now starting at 2 p.m. today. I was hoping it would start at noon, but it's great because now I get to see all of you guys, hang out with you guys for a little bit. But yeah, we should get more clarity hopefully at 2 o'clock when court starts today.
And let me say, you weren't able to come on the show yesterday because of the scheduling. You had like 5 minutes to get back into court. We have a lot of great responses for you, Elizabeth. And by the way, if anybody has comments or questions for Elizabeth, she's in that courtroom every day. Shoot them over. We'll make sure to answer them. Real quick, I have an expert panel, but I have with me right now litigator Rich Schoenstein. If I could bring him on real quick. Yeah, I got him. Rich, good to see you. Am I right? They're not abandoning arson and kidnapping and
I believe you're right, and this is why. I'm looking at the draft verdict sheet that that your great producers printed out for me, and it says basically the first question is, do you find defendant Sean Combs guilty of racketeering? And then it asks a question about whether every single predicate theory has been proven or not proven. So it goes over kidnapping under California law, kidnapping under New York law, arson under California law, bribery under California law, and so on. As I read this, the prosecution is only conceding attempted kidnapping under California law, and attempted kidnapping under New York law, and attempted arson under California law. And probably the reason they're doing that is so they don't have to get into what is attempted and not attempted in the jury instructions and in closing arguments. They're just streamlining the case. But it's still very much about kidnapping and arson and all of those other crimes.
So I go back to Elizabeth. I mean, we have questions coming in. Erica Charlotte says, and we've been talking about this, does the streamlining mean the arson and kidnapping are no longer being charged? We're saying the complete opposite. It still seems to be part of the case. But they ask, are we to disregard Kid Cudi's and Capricorn Clark's testimonies?
It doesn't seem like we should disregard that at all because there are still so many kind of layers to that. And sure, yes, in terms of the attempted arson and, you know, the defense really kind of pointing out that there was female DNA that was found on the Molotov cocktail, something that they really wanted to make sure the jury understood that, especially when it also came to the whole fingerprint debacle and just the insinuation that fingerprints might have been destroyed on behalf of allegedly, you know, Sean Combs possibly having something to do with that, which we don't know that to be the case at all. It was something that was, objected to by the defense, and it was something that also is going to be struck from the record. So when the jury goes back to deliberate about all this stuff, all these witnesses and all their testimony, they're not going to see that portion of the record or anything like that. But in terms of just disregarding Capricorn Clark's testimony, there's still so many layers to that in terms of possibly forced labor, possibly just her experience working with Sean Combs and just what she had all witnessed with Cassie, and also how Capricorn Clark's testimony may help verify Cassie's claims, all those types of things. And in regards to Kid Cudi, I don't think we should disregard his testimony either, especially when it comes to, you know, allegations of the threats that maybe he had heard from Cassie in terms of just sexually explicit videos being released, all of that sort. So I don't think we should rush to judgment as far as dismissing their very important testimony altogether. I think, you know, when people see a letter that says, oh, the prosecution's dropping this, I think they were like, oh my God, that means it's over.
Right.
That means it's a sure win for the defense. But, you know, there's still so many layers to it that I think that we should hold off on rushing to judgment just yet until we really know during this charge conference today.
And we're going to talk more about that. Elizabeth, while I have you, what can we expect from this charge conference today? I mean, again, I'm looking at this letter, the government's response to proposed jury instructions. It's really interesting because they talk about what the instructions should be for sex trafficking and forced labor. They talk about, for example, earlier consent from a victim does not mean, is not determinative of whether or not a victim was sex trafficked. They talk about how payment is not determinative, that the court instruct the jury that sex trafficking, labor, and payment to the victim for that conduct are not mutually exclusive. They talk about cumulative conduct. What are you expecting today regarding this charge conference? Because I will say, I think it's quite important in any case, but quite important in this kind of case.
I definitely think today is an important day because we'll really kind of see how they're going to map out the instructions that'll be given to the jury once they eventually deliberate. And it's very important. This is a pretty complicated case. So I think the government putting in their proposed instructions in terms of, just because maybe an alleged victim had agreed initially to doing the hotel nights or the freak-offs, that just because they initially may have agreed to do it doesn't mean towards the end that they still weren't apprehensive. They still wanted to say no. They still conveyed that they said no. And I think that's where they have to really kind of lay out very clearly, especially possibly in layman's terms, just how murky the waters can get in terms of whether or not that maybe the jurors are talking, or maybe the jurors are thinking that possibly because, both Jane and Cassie were in relationships with the defendant, that maybe that kind of muddies the water in terms of, can somebody who was in a relationship with the defendant be a victim of sex trafficking? I think the government has to really kind of lay that out in their proposed instructions. I think in terms of the defense also, I think they're going to want to make sure that the jury also knows very clearly what each predicate act under RICO is. It seems like from the most part, from my understanding of being inside the courtroom, I think they might be a little more concerned with count one, especially just all the, underlying things that go with count one, again, that being racketeering, conspiracy, and just kind of, again, laying it out very simply for the jury. Because even sometimes when I'm in the courtroom, I'm kind of like, okay, what did I just hear? What is this interpreted? And I'm just, I'm not a lawyer or anything like that. So, imagine me being on a jury. I would want things just really spelled out very clearly. So I think both sides are going to take their time making sure that they get everything that they want in on these proposed jury instructions. But I also think an interesting thing, Jesse, is I'm kind of interested to see if the prosecutors and the defense attorney who are going to be giving the closing arguments are going to be inside the courtroom today for this charge conference. Because yesterday the judge said that, he is okay with the whichever lawyer is going to be giving the closing argument not to attend the charge conference, and the other lawyers can kind of argue everything out. But I'll be interested to see if possibly, Maureen Comey will be in there, if Mark Agnifilo will be in there, who I presume is going to be giving the closing arguments in this trial. But we'll see if they'll show up now that court has been pushed back a couple of hours today to begin at 2.
Right, because they need to prepare. They need to prepare for closing arguments, which are quite important and quite lengthy in this case. Before I let you go, Elizabeth, what's the vibe like we've seen this past week? What was the vibe of Diddy? What's the vibe of the jury? What can you tell us? How do they look? How do they, what's their demeanor like as we're coming to the conclusion of this case?
Yeah, well, as far as the jury is concerned, I kind of feel like maybe they were kind of tired of possibly reading all those text messages, watching all those sexually explicit videos, because that is what it felt like for most of the duration of this week, even going back to late last week. And so, I think maybe for the jurors, they're probably a little at the tired point of this trial. It's been almost 2 months at this point. And so I think they're kind of like, okay, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Eventually we'll get this case. Eventually we'll deliberate. But again, I'm just guessing. I'm not inside their heads or anything like that. But as far as Sean Combs is concerned, I will say this. I think that in terms of just his defense attorneys and their arguments, and I think that he seems pretty proud of what the defense put up, even though we weren't expecting a very long case from the defense's case in chief. Really, it was just them reading stuff into evidence, reading exhibits, and reading a bunch of stipulations. But it seems like, from what I could tell of just his demeanor and vibe inside the courtroom, he seemed pretty pleased with what his defense gave, especially during those cross-examinations of the many witnesses, including Don Richard, including of Mia, including of Jane, including of all the special agents, just all the various witnesses that took the stand on behalf of the government, and even in terms of just the assistants and their testimony too. So I think as far as just the end of the trial, we're getting to the beginning of the end here. I think, we'll see kind of what happens with closing arguments tomorrow, but it seems like, possibly maybe Sean Combs is feeling pretty good right now. He said the judge was doing a good job, an excellent job, he added yesterday, and it actually got a chuckle from the judge too. And so I think as far as the vibe goes yesterday, he seems pretty upbeat, given that, on the tail end of this, it's possibly that, the jury will come with a decision, and I can only imagine the weight and how that might possibly feel on a defendant, especially as high profile as Sean Combs.
You mentioned concern. We put up a poll. Are you concerned about the charges dropped last minute influencing the jury's perception? 46% say very concerned. 34% say not at all. 19% say somewhat concerned. Interesting. I don't know. if the jury even knows granularly what was dropped or not. They don't know about this, but they will be presented jury instructions, and maybe, I don't recall during opening statements if they were that specific, saying aiding and abetting kidnapping, conspiracy kidnapping, attempted I think they just mentioned kidnapping. I don't know if the jury really is going to know so much about this. But Elizabeth Millner, thank you so much. You and I are going to get together for our recap episode later on today on Sidebar. We'll figure out what the jury instructions are, what the charge conference was like. Thank you so much, and get out of the heat. Get inside that courtroom. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jesse.